for everyone joining us here today, for being here for this panel on, as she said, navigating forced labor laws. So I'm Gavin Bade. I'm a trade and economics reporter at Politico. And our discussion today is will center largely on the newly enacted Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which you may hear called the UFLPA or just the Uyghur Act, right? So as we all know, I think this audience is pretty familiar with this bill, but it represents a pretty big shift in how the US government is attempting to limit the trade of goods made with forced labor, and also a shift in how we regulate imports into the US in general, right? And that's because for the first time, the law directs the Customs and Border Protection, to institute a de facto prohibition on imports from a certain region, this being the northwestern Chinese region of Xinjiang. This is the epicenter of numerous allegations of forced labor, other human rights abuses from the Chinese government against the Muslim majority Uyghur population. The law does this with something you may have heard bandied about. It's called the Rebuttable Presumption. And that means that just the US government will assume that any good coming in from Xinjiang will have some forced labor involved in its manufacture, and so will be blocked at the border. Now, companies can, in theory, prove to customs that these imports are free of forced labor and win release of their products. But the process for doing this has been, up to this point, a bit opaque for many importers. So it's still very early in enforcement of this law. It just came into force in June, but it's already pushed many companies to more fully investigate their Chinese supply chains and perhaps even consider moving out of the country. So today we have two very experienced panelists to discuss these compliance issues, give us some insight on how industry is responding. We have Blake Harden. She's the Vice President of International Trade at the Retail Industry Leaders Association, and Nate Herman, the Senior Vice President of Policy at the American Apparel and Footwear Association, two of the leading groups here in Washington, lobbying and engaging on these issues. So with all of that, if one of you can take off, let's hear a little bit about how your members are responding to some of these new requirements. Have they had things seized at the border? And what has been the general mood among your members since this came into force?
I guess I'll start.
Okay, go ahead.
And just sort of, talk about sort of the general situation. So this went into effect, or the rebuttable presumption went into effect on June 21. So we've been in this for now about 3 months. And we've seen really brisk enforcement of this. So it's not just in our space. Obviously, we've seen a lot of enforcement as relates to cotton products in particular, but we've also seen and heard anecdotally that there's been a lot of enforcement in the solar industry, a lot of enforcement, or some enforcement with electronics, some enforcement with foodstuffs. So this is not just a cotton apparel issue anymore. This is well beyond, because it covers every product. What we've also seen is that no import is safe. And that, if you're gonna have one takeaway from this, that's what the one takeaway is. It's just not imports coming from China. We've seen imports coming from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Bangladesh, from Indonesia, from Korea, and elsewhere being detained under the UFLPA. So this is not just, oh, I'm not importing from China, I don't have to worry about that. It really covers everything. And just, for the specifics, it's not just entities, it's not just targeting imports that are entities on the UFLPA entity list. It goes beyond that. We don't know how it goes beyond that. And that's part of the issue, is that we don't have any hard numbers from US Customs and Border Protection on their enforcement. We've asked for those numbers repeatedly. Before UFLPA went into effect, we asked for those numbers as it relates to withhold release orders. We haven't gotten those numbers. The only number that we've seen is that the US Customs Border Protection publishes a monthly report on its activities. In its August monthly report, it had one sentence buried down near the bottom of the report that said that it has targeted 838 entities or entries with a value of about $266 million related to withhold release orders and UFLPA. It doesn't say what targeted means. We don't know if those shipments are actually detained or not. We don't know how many of those were related to UFLPA or to other withhold release orders. But just to put that number in context, for our industry, we were covered under 2 withhold release orders starting back in October 2020 So between October 2020 and June 2022, we think there were 1,500 to 1,600 shipments detained under the XPCC withhold release order and the Xinjiang cotton withhold release order. So that's over a year and a half, 1,500 to 1,600 shipments, and then 1 month, 838 shipments targeted. So the enforcement is definitely ramped up.
Mm-hmm. And Nate, just to jump in here, I think this audience probably knows, but just for clarity here, the withhold release orders, these are more narrow import blockades that have been put in place. Can you just say a little bit about that in case?
Right, yeah, so withhold release orders are for can cover any product from any country or a region within a country. They can be region-wide withhold release orders, such as the withhold release order that was put in place in January 2021 on cotton and tomatoes from Xinjiang. But more likely, they are a specific plantation, a specific farm, a specific factory, such as rubber gloves from certain factories in Malaysia or Indonesia. And so these cover all countries. But when the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act went into effect, any withhold release order that was directly related to Xinjiang was overtaken by the UFLPA. And so now all enforcement's under UFLPA. But the withhold release orders are still in effect for every other country and every other product.
Thank you for that. A little useful context there. Blake, what about you? How are your members responding to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think largely the same in terms of what Nate shared. I think, no surprise, we share a lot of the same questions, but we've also taken note of the most recent, operational statistics. I think Nate's couple of points that Nate made are worth reinforcing. The first thing is that, no import is safe. Just because it doesn't come from China under this new law doesn't mean that it couldn't be stopped under the UFLPA. This covers goods that are made in whole or in part in Xinjiang, but then also by any of the entities on an entity list. So that means the entire supply chain, all the way down to the raw material, has to be free from a connection to Xinjiang or a connection to any of the entities on the entity list. And I just think that's an important point to keep reinforcing. And Nate obviously shared some of the countries that we have heard anecdotally there have been detentions from. So, and we understand that detentions are happening across the ports of entry. This is not just happening on the West Coast. It is happening at large ports, small ports. There's activity clearly occurring all around the country in terms of CBP's enforcement activities. So, I think we're only 3 months in, so we're interested to see, of course, how this ramps up. But we're also very keen to see, additional statistics from CBP as they gather more data about what exactly is occurring, so that we're not just having to kind of anecdotally put the pieces together.
Mm-hmm. And so my next question is, if we hear that detentions are happening, we don't know exactly how many, but we know that, your members, other people are having detentions happen. What happens next if you're a company, your product gets stopped at the border? The presumption is supposed to be rebuttable, right? You're supposed to be able to try to prove to customs, hey, our stuff is clean. It was not made with forced labor. How do you go about proving that to customs? And what do you have to do in your own supply chain to be able to get them that information?
Yeah, Gavin, I'm happy to take a first stab at this one. All good questions, and I think we still have questions about this exactly. But just from like a technical standpoint, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act has language in it allowing for an exception to the rebuttable presumption, which is what you were alluding to, right? So the presumption is theoretically rebuttable. It requires that an importer provide, by clear and convincing evidence, sufficient documentation and evidence to CBP that, again, the goods are not in any way connected to Xinjiang or the entities on the entity list. That an exception in the statute is that there is a connection to Xinjiang or an entity on the entity list, and you are trying to prove, and you must do so by clear and convincing evidence, that yes, there was a connection, but no forced labor was not used in the production of this good. And so that is rebutting the presumption. That is an exception under the UFLPA. And under that process, the commissioner has to agree, and a report is then sent to Congress that would be public, indicating that this exception was exercised. One of the things we've spent a lot of time talking about since the act was passed is the need for what we understand is being called an applicability review. So this is the instance where you have goods detained at a port of entry, but you do not believe there is a connection in your supply chain to Xinjiang or to one of the entities on the entity list. And again, you would have to believe that's true for the entirety of your supply chain for that product. That's a separate process from this exception track. And, we're glad it exists. I think there's still a lot of questions about how you can demonstrate sufficiently to CBP that the UFLPA does not in fact apply, that that the goods should not have been stopped in the first instance. We understand, at least as of a couple of weeks ago, that so far nobody had made an attempt to rebut the presumption and enact this exception track. In other words, we're not aware so far of anybody saying, yes, I have a connection to the region or to one of these entities, but no forced labor was not used in the production of this good. We do know that there have been many requests for what's this admissibility review, this attempt by importers to say, you have stopped my product, but we do not believe it should have been stopped in the first instance. And so they work with CBP to try to work through that. The challenge under this law is, and I don't want to get too technical here, but the UFLPA is being implemented with a different authority than what CBP uses for the withhold release orders. And so there are more expedited timelines associated with these reviews that are taking place. So it's a 30-day timeline under UFLPA for importers to provide all of the documentation to demonstrate that its goods, for instance, should not have been stopped in the first instance, and for CBP to then agree. So it's a pretty quick timeline, given that you're expected, at least what we understand from CBP, to provide that documentation for the whole supply chain, and then for CBP to review it and make a decision. But we do understand that there are those types of conversations happening with importers who have had products detained.
Wow, that's a lot of really great information there. I learned a lot just from that one answer. So just to back up a little bit, we have two separate tracks, right? You could apply for the exception track and say, yes, our product came from Xinjiang, but there's no forced labor. That seems like a pretty high bar to clear. And as so far as you know, no one's tried that yet. But what people have tried is the applicability or the applicability.
Applicability, scope, it's been called a couple of different things.
Saying, hey, customs, you think this is from Xinjiang. It's not. None of this is. And we have to give you a bunch of information then to prove it. So Nate, I want to bring you in here. Do we know what information you have to give to customs to prove that, hey, Xinjiang is not involved here, or forced labor is not involved here? Or are you kind of just trying to throw information at the wall and see what sticks with them?
So this is part of the problem that we run into here, is that you're sort of in a situation that you're guilty until proven innocent, and you don't know what the evidence is against you. So when you have a shipment stopped, or when CBP, U.S. Customs stops a shipment, all the importer gets is a detention order that says your shipment was stopped because of UFLPA. It doesn't say which part of the shipment, because if this is an entire container load or multiple container loads, you could have 13 or 14 purchase orders in that shipment. So you don't know which part of the shipment triggered the UFLPA detention. You don't know if it was because of the supplier, if it was because of the supplier's supplier. You don't know if because it was the country you were sourcing it from. you don't have any information. So you're trying to prove a negative here that you don't have anything. So but in terms of what you're providing to CBP, largely from what we understand and from the CBP operational guidance and the UFLPA enforcement strategy, it's mostly a document-driven exercise. So you're trying to prove the source of the raw material all the way back to the raw material. So, cotton in our case could be silica or even back to the quartzite, which is used to make silica. For solar, you're talking about way back to the raw mineral, the raw material. Prove the origin of that there's no nexus with Xinjiang. And then you have to prove that raw material was used throughout the supply chain to make the product that was then detained. So that's, you need purchase orders, invoices, shipping documents, including bills of lading, production records. You need inventory records. You need to translate all those documents into English. So you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of documents. And then on top of that, you need to put some sort of narrative that explains how all these documents tie together. Because otherwise, US Customs and Border Protection will say, oh, you've dumped a bunch of documents on us, and you're just trying to bury us in paperwork, and so we think you're lying or whatever. And so you need a narrative that sort of tells all that. And then as Blake said, you have 30 days from the date of detention to get all this information to Customs. Customs is supposed to give you an answer in that time period, and that doesn't really happen either. So we think that's where they're going, although in some cases, in our experience, the documentation, even when they have all this, the importer has all this, doesn't seem to be enough. But the response you get from Customs is that you provide insufficient evidence. It doesn't say why it was insufficient, what part was insufficient. All you get is you provide insufficient evidence. And that's literally the one sentence you get back in response. And so that's where we're left with. But that's, right now, it's really a document-driven exercise.
It almost sounds like an investigative journalism exercise, right? You have to go and dig up all of these documents. You have to get them translated. You have to make a narrative, and you have a hard deadline by the time you need to run your story, right? I see some commonalities there. My next question is, okay, yeah, if you have to do all of that as a company, how are your companies responding? Do they have to hire more compliance officers? Are they sending people over to China to try to check on these factories? Do they kind of have to take their suppliers just at their word that the information they're giving them is accurate? Like how actually do you see them effectuating their compliance here?
Well, I'll jump in. I'm sure Blake has some thoughts here too, but I mean, the bottom line is you need to have traceability and transparency in your supply chain back to the raw material. Now, the question is how you do it. So Customs wants this document-driven exercise. That is one way to get there. The issue is, as you said, how do you verify the documents? How do you know that it's all true, what's been given to you? And we know in places like China, which is obviously the nexus of this issue, that they have laws in place, such as an anti-sanctions law, that makes suppliers in China very nervous about providing you these documents and about complying with US sanctions, because then that brings them into violation of Chinese law, which then can mean punishment, jail terms, and losing their business, other issues. And so that makes it very difficult. And so bottom line, this is still a document-driven exercise, but then you try and bring in solutions to try and help you do that. And there is no single solution or technology that's going to solve your problem here. So I just want to make that. But there's sort of three types of solutions that could help. First is the solutions that help you sort of manage and analyze the data. You're collecting, and we just talked about, for one single shipment, you could be collecting hundreds of documents. How do you manage all that data? You can't put it in an Excel spreadsheet because, how do you manage that? How do you analyze the data? So you're getting this from, you have 10,000 different SKUs, different items in your supply chain. How when you manage all that data and then make sure that, hey, maybe there's some trends here that I should be looking at. How do you manage all the data? So there's a lot of solutions out there that help you manage and analyze the data when you collect it, because maybe you can figure out that, hey, something doesn't add up here. That document doesn't seem right because when we collected this from 5 other suppliers, they've said something completely different. How do you determine risk? So what are the product areas that might be the most vulnerable? So in our industry, obviously cotton, with 20% of the world's cotton from Xinjiang, that's a high risk area. So you look at your cotton supply chains first if you're trying to manage your time and resources. We've also heard things about PVC materials, and PVC can go into the soles of shoes. They can go into spandex. We've heard about rayon. So maybe that's where you spend your time first. If you're looking, you can't do everything at once, look at the supply chains that are the highest risk. And other industries, I hope, are doing the same as we are. But you also look at relationships. There's this entity list. There's the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is one of the entities on the entity list. There's estimates that they have anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 subsidiaries. How do you look at that? There are a lot of solutions providers that use public records to say, oh, well, there might be a relationship here that you should be looking at. And then finally, there are the sort of the technologies that you can use to validate what you've collected. So you've collected something that says this product has no nexus with Xinjiang, that the cotton came from the United States, and that the yarn came from Korea, and then it was made into a garment in Vietnam. So how do you validate that? There's a couple of different technologies out there: isotopic testing, DNA tracing, DNA tagging, that can help verify that the data, the documents that you collected are true, or you might need to go back and check on things. And so that's where we're left with. Nothing solves the whole problem, but that's sort of what our members are put through, is that we have to get the documents, but we need to, how do we use it to verify or determine where the highest risk might be in our supply chains? Yeah.
Maybe just to add really quick, Gavin, I think Nate covered it for sure. And it's pretty complex, as you can imagine. But I think it's important to remind folks too, that these requirements apply no matter the size of the company. And so, many of our companies have had really robust compliance programs for, in some cases, decades. And so, they may be expanding those programs as a result of this law, right? And sort of the breadth of it, and doing all the things that Nate just talked about. But then you also have small and medium-sized companies, 1-2 person shops, that, everybody has to comply with this. And as you can imagine, that's a pretty big undertaking for some folks who may be really unfamiliar, because remember, we still have a forced labor statute on the books, right? So it was never okay to bring in, especially once they removed the consumptive demand clause. And again, I don't want to get too technical for the audience, but, certainly in the last several years, putting aside the UFLPA, goods made with forced labor were not allowed to be imported into the country. And so there was this sort of broad requirement. But this is taking it certainly to another level. And again, all folks are expected to comply with it.
And just one thing to add to what Blake just said is that also the complexity of this issue here. In our industry, we don't even own the factory that makes the shirt or the shoe. We contract, it's called contract manufacturing. We contract with those factories. So you're not saying, so if you look at a cotton shirt, we don't even own or have direct control over the factory that makes the cotton shirt, much less the fabric that went into the cotton shirt, much less the yarn that went into the fabric, much less the gin cotton that went into the yarn, much less the trader who sold the cotton to the ginner, much less to the farmer who grew the cotton in the first place. And so you're talking about having to have visibility and some control all the way back in your supply chain, 5 or 6 steps, when you don't control any of those steps in the supply chain. And so it's a very complicated process.
It sounds like a complicated process and an expensive one, right? I wonder, do you see some of your companies just kind of throwing up their hands and saying, we're going to pull out of Xinjiang and we're going to try to get around this by just not doing business as much as we can in China? And is that even possible? You've already said no import is safe because, could be getting an import from Vietnam, but they think you used yarn from, cotton or yarn from Xinjiang. Is there any way out of this predicament for companies? Can they just say, I'm going to try to do everything domestically, or are supply chains just so globalized that that's only an option theoretically and not really in reality?
Sure. I'll start. Nate and I are looking at each other on Zoom. So first, our members don't have any direct connections to Xinjiang. I mean, what we really are talking about here is the in part portion of the requirement, right? Is trying to find, to make sure there is not a connection deeper in the supply chain to Xinjiang or to one of these entities. And I think, Nate's description about not owning the full vertical, sort of tells you that this gets really tricky, right? To get all this information and connect all those dots. So there's certainly that piece of it. And again, no import is safe. I think the other piece of this too is, we live in a globalized world where companies are serving all sorts of different markets. So I don't know that it's really practical on a whole host of levels to say, just make it all here, particularly when the inputs are not available here. So I don't really think that's a practical solution either. But Nate, I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yeah, Blake described it really well, the situation, but because it goes well beyond, and you can't, as Blake said, you can't just stop importing the final product from China. You have to go back further and make sure that all the inputs and then all the raw materials that go into those inputs were also not from Xinjiang or from China. Having said that, there are some companies that we know of that are trying to go that route. But even for them, the plan is over 2, 3, 5 years to achieve that goal. And it's going to be a very expensive process to do that because some of these inputs, they're not made anywhere else. And so you're trying to create whole new supply chains that don't exist today in order to get around having any nexus with Xinjiang or with China. And so people are thinking about that, but it's hard. And these companies are doing that are also not selling in China. We do need to note that China is a huge market where their entire middle class is bigger than our entire population. So that's another aspect of this as well.
Well, it seems like a very difficult situation for a lot of importers, but it's not the only forced labor law that we have to deal with, right? It's just in the United States, there's also a new European Union forced labor proposal that actually just was published last week. It's a little bit of a different creature than the US. They, instead of an import ban, they're going for what they call a market ban, saying, we're not going to police things at the border, but we're going to put a prohibition on forced labor in our marketplace. From my perspective, it seems, similar to what the US had before, like we weren't ever supposed to have goods made with forced labor, but I wonder how you all see it. What are the differences between what the EU is proposing and what the US has just done?
I'll take a first stab at it here. So we're still analyzing the proposal. It's a 62-page proposal. So, but based on what we've analyzed so far, the concern that we have is that the devil is always in the details, and so many of the details are left till after the proposal is proposed and implemented. They're talking about that 18 months after the proposal is approved, that the European Commission will put out detailed guidelines. they talk about that they're going to create these sources, including this database, within 18 months. Again, 18 months after the proposal is approved. And so what is there seems somewhat reasonable, that there's that if they suspect a product possibly being made in whole or in part with forced labor, and the difference with the EU law versus the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is, as you said, Gavin, it covers everything. So it's not just focused on China or Xinjiang. It covers everything. So it's more like the U.S. forced labor statute that way, except that it's market-based versus import-based. That you go through this preliminary investigation. The seller, in this case, the seller is notified. They have 15 days to provide information to the relevant country authority. And then 30 days after that, there's a decision made on whether the product was made with forced labor or not. And then if it's made with if it's believed made with forced labor, the product is pulled from the market. And then the importer has, or excuse me, the seller has 15 days to respond to that with new information to get the country authority to change their mind that it wasn't. And if the country authority decides that the evidence is not compelling, then the subject goods must be destroyed. So a little different than us, we had the option here that once the shipment's detained, you can re-export the shipment out of the country. That option is not available in Europe, but there is notice to the seller before the shipment or before the product is removed. The seller does have an opportunity to respond. The question is, will the evidence that led to the preliminary judgment be shared with the seller so that it can refute that evidence? We have jurisprudence and due process here in the United States, which our own U.S. Customs is not following at this moment, but hopefully that would be adopted in the European model. And so there's things that we need to see. The devil's in the details, and we just don't have those yet. But it seems on its face a little bit more reasonable, at least how they approach it.
Blake, do you have anything to add on the European proposal?
No, Nate covered it beautifully.
Well, I should say to our audience as well, we have the Q&A function here. I see a few questions here. Please keep those rolling in. It looks like we will have a little bit of time for questions coming up here in just a moment. I see some good ones. We'll get to those in just a moment here. I had one kind of bigger picture question for us, as we're looking forward at this. I was at a conference earlier this summer with someone from Customs, with a Customs official, and someone asked them, well, what about other issues of forced labor outside of Xinjiang, right? We know from reports that the Chinese government often relocates workers from Xinjiang to other parts of the country. They're not certainly free to go on their own recognizance and not work when they want to, right? It's still a forced labor issue. And the Customs official had to say, look, there are limits to what we can do. This is our our statutory authorities to go after Xinjiang right now. We still need to, we can't handle that yet. We can't handle the other regions, other cases of forced labor. And it just revealed to me how big and complex this issue is and how hard it is to combat worldwide. I wonder, what are your members doing to try to root out forced labor? Maybe that could be not just in Xinjiang, but other parts of their supply chains. And is it even possible to get it all?
Well, I mean, that's the goal, right? And I think as we've mentioned before, and Gavin, your question actually raises a couple things. But again, we have a forced labor statute on the books, right? So whether UFLPA, of course, is Xinjiang specific. I think it's intended to capture the poverty alleviation program or the pairing program that you sort of alluded to with the movement of Uyghurs and other ethnic minority groups around China by including this entity list, right? And in the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, who put together that list, it is actually a compilation of 4 different lists, and they've just combined it into one. And I think it's designed to get at this, right? And folks, if you haven't seen it, you can look on DHS's website. They have a Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force page, as well as the strategy is posted there and some frequently asked questions, not to be confused with CBP's page on the UFLPA. Government efficiency. So maybe I'd note that that's one of the things we've asked for too, is maybe one place to house everything so that folks can go to that place when they're looking for information. But you raised a couple of interesting things too that I can't let go. One is the resource issue. And I think there are a lot of questions about whether and how CBP is resourced for the task of this UFLPA. We know they're asking for additional funding, moving forward to staff up their forced labor division. And so I think everyone's expectation is that there will be increased funding in future years. And with that will likely come broader enforcement. They will be able to go after more with respect to the UFLPA. So I think that's an important point to note. I think as they're staffing up, one of the things that we continue to highlight is the need to ensure that those new bodies that are added to the workforce are appropriately skilled and trained, in the issue of forced labor, but also on the complexity of supply chains. We feel like that's a really important piece of this, so that, over time, maybe we're not having so many detentions of goods that shouldn't have been stopped in the first instance, right? Because the costs in those cases are still borne by the importers. So, if you have a shipment stopped and it's sitting there, you're still on the hook for the fees if it shouldn't have been stopped in the first instance. So I think your question there's lots of little issues in there, and I just couldn't help but maybe just flag those as we think about all the pieces of this. But the other thing too is I think, and we haven't really talked about this yet, but our members are, they have compliance programs. They're looking to root out forced labor wherever it may occur, and they're continuing to do that work. But I think there's also a lot of opportunity for partnership that really hasn't occurred yet. Public-private partnership. Nate talked about some of the different types of technologies that are out there and solutions. A lot of them are relatively new. And I think, companies are eager to work with government to test some of those out, to see if those solutions really do work, what commodities they work for, are they scalable, all of the things, are they reliable? I think, that's something that could be a great endeavor for the government to work with the private sector on. So we can also move these technologies along, right? So they are more accessible, perhaps more affordable. And so those smaller and medium-sized companies that maybe can't even afford it now, maybe it becomes within reach down the line. There's also, we continue to call too for the government to work on a cohesive plan to root out forced labor. So a one USG approach. Couldn't help but notice, right, the USTR forced labor strategy request for comments. So you have, differing agencies working at this from different angles. And we hope that the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force can serve as a convening body to bring all these pieces together so that there is consistent guidance coming out of the government, consistent messaging, and then also consistent engagement with our allies. We need to be working with our international partners so that, we are all singing from the same sheet of music. I think that is ultimately helpful to U.S. companies as well. Nate, what'd I miss?
I think you got everything, but in terms of getting back to the companies themselves, this really drives back home to what I mentioned before, is that you need the full traceability and transparency back in your supply chain. We've spent the last 2+ decades trying to prevent, root out, mitigate forced labor in our supply chains. But the more we learn, and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act really brings that home, is that the forced labor can happen anywhere in the supply chain. You can have foreign migrant workers who have their passports withheld or had to pay for their jobs, and so they're in sort of indentured servitude. That could be way up the supply chain. It's not just at the factory making the shirt or the shoe. You have to really look all the way back, and really look everywhere in your supply chain, and put in systems and processes in place to do that. And so that's really one point I want to drive home. And then, you know, along with Blake said, is that the government can really help us here. Is that obviously through this process, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, when they're bringing on all these extra personnel, they've learned a lot of information. They could share that information with us. There shouldn't be a game of gotcha. It should be sharing information so that if they know there's bad actors, share that with us, and then we can make sure that puts into our risk matrix to make sure we don't have any nexus with those bad actors. And so it really needs to be a cooperative venture. We really want to change the problem on the ground. We need that cooperation. We need to be working together, because that's our shared goal.
Thank you, guys. I want to get to a few of the audience questions here with the time remaining. We've only got 4 in here, so, you know, keep them rolling in if you have any open queries here. 2 of them are a bit similar, and they kind of, they go to this point, you know, is there any clear indication? I think we've talked about this a little bit, but just to put a finer point on it, is there a clear indication on what CBP is using to flag a shipment as in violation of the Uyghur Act or potential violation? Is it, you know, does it have to be a clear link to Xinjiang? Is there a second tier where they, you know, think, okay, well, these certain suppliers, we know they work in Xinjiang, you know, is there any sort of indication at what the trigger point is for detention?
It's a great question.
I would say, the short answer is no.
Yeah.
We have no idea what they're using to target. And that's part of the problem, is that based on the limited guidance they provide, there's not really a way to tell. Mm-hmm. So
and I should say they're not a lot more forthcoming with the press than they are to their industry stakeholders either. Right. If there's any question about that, I can't get this information out of them either.
Right. I mean, we think there are indicators if there's a major report from an NGO, then we think that maybe that's where it is, but that doesn't necessarily correlate. But yeah, we've been trying first now with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but before with the withhold release orders, we've been trying for almost 3 years now to figure that out. So.
Yeah, and I mean, look, to be fair, CBP is not going to necessarily share its targeting information, right? It's going to tell you that's law enforcement sensitive, and okay, that's fair. But I think this goes back to Nate's earlier point about at least having some indication on the detention notice about, like, look, if you feel sure enough to stop this, you know, what was it? What piece of this, you know, garment is the concern, or, you know, can you identify something in the supply chain that did cause the trigger? That would ultimately be incredibly helpful. You know, to Nate's point earlier too, you know, the goal is to be able to share information bidirectionally, so we all are getting better at this. You know, the goal is to root out forced labor, not to drive up detentions. So, you know, we think sharing some of that information would be ultimately helpful, you know, to that broader goal.
Mm-hmm. Kind of on a similar subject here, I think we know that there haven't been any success stories of people proving that forced labor is not involved in their item. But have there been any success stories yet of people being able to prove in that applicability review that, hey, this is not a part of Xinjiang? I know you probably can't mention names of your members, but you know of anyone who's actually been able to get any product back from CBP after they've been detained under the Uyghur Act? No one. Short
answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so we know of at least a couple of instances where a shipment was stopped and an importer was able to demonstrate to CBP that it should not have been.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you can say about the special sauce that they, sorry, Nate, go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's what we've been figuring out, because as we know, they give you no information on why they detain the product. They give you no information on why what you submitted to get the product released is insufficient. They also do the same when they release a shipment. So in one of those cases, they got a one-line email response from CBP that said, your shipment has been released. It didn't say why, what was the special sauce that got it released. But just to note the timeline, we work in an industry where we deal with seasonal product, summer clothes for summer, clothes for winter, coats. It took from the time this shipment was detained until it was released, it took 8 weeks. Took 6 weeks from when the importer provided all the information to CBP for it to be released. But again, they have no idea what led to release. It was literally one line email from the port saying your shipment is now released.
Yeah, and I think one of the other pieces of this that'll be sort of interesting to see how it plays out, that we've requested more clarity on, is whether when a shipment with the same fact pattern, same product, same supply chain shows up at the border, does that wind up getting stopped again, and does that importer have to go through the exercise all over again? I think that's an open question and something we're concerned about, but we'll see what happens.
8 weeks is not exactly fast fashion, right? It's like 2 cycles at Zara, maybe more. Moving on, we have a question about the European proposal here. Do we know what types of products will get flagged under the EU proposal? Is it possible for members of the public to report products of concern? And if so, could this be weaponized to inconvenience companies?
So again, this is just a proposal. We're still in the early days. For this proposal to become law, it still has to be approved by the European Parliament and the EU Council of Ministers, which are the 27 EU member states. That process can take anywhere from about 1.5 years to 2 years. So this EU proposal will not, with the 24-month timeline after it's approved, we're talking about that this is going to be 3 to 4 years before this proposal is implemented, and we know what that looks like. But they made very clear in the proposal, the European Commission, that this covers any product, that any product, no matter where it's made. So if it's made in EU, doesn't matter, it can still be a target of this law when it comes into effect. It doesn't matter if it's imported from outside the EU, made in the EU, anything can be a target. The proposal does specifically talk about sources of information, and it talks about public sources, and it specifically talks about NGO petitions, so petitions from non-governmental organizations and advocacy groups. It does not say the public writ large, but the implication is that yes, that can be submitted. That can trigger the preliminary investigation, which then can trigger a preliminary decision, which that's the initial time that the government, the authority would reach out to the seller of the product, and that's not when the shipment, or not when the product's taken off the market. It's the preliminary phase. So, but yes, that could potentially lead to what the questioner described.
Mm-hmm. Just generally, I mean, we're getting toward the end here, and I wonder, just from your perspective, is this law working so far? In China circles, you hear rumors of, factories or suppliers that'll just have, 2 separate lines in the factory, one right next to the other, and saying, this is the one that's free of forced labor, and this is the one that, is not, and we'll send this stuff to, Hugo Boss, who maybe doesn't care. We'll send this stuff to the American companies who really do, but there's not that much difference at the end of the day. Like, are we actually rooting out forced labor with this, or are we just making people more clever and hiding it?
Well, this gets back to what Blake talked about with the need for the coordination and a one USG approach, and then US government working with others. In this particular case, forced labor is just one component of a much larger campaign of oppression against ethnic Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And if you really want to make a difference and end that campaign, which has led to the forced labor, you need to do more than just the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. You need to do more than just focus on exports of products that might have a nexus with Xinjiang. You need to do a lot more than that. So, for example, this law has been in place for, the rebuttable presumption has been in place for 3 months. Before that, there were the withhold release orders. China has not changed its rhetoric one iota. It was yelling in the UN Human Rights Council last week that the UN Human Rights Council should never released its report on Xinjiang, and it got 20 countries to back its position, at the UN Human Rights Council last week. They're arguing at the UN General Assembly this week that this is an internal matter, that all the actions we've taken were for poverty alleviation and to prevent terrorism. That their rhetoric has not changed one iota because of this. Now, there have been some net effects. We heard for the first time that sales of Xinjiang cotton have decreased significantly, and the Chinese government had to step in and buy a lot of the cotton because nobody else would buy it. Might be true, might not be true. And that just started happening, but even that hasn't changed China's position on this, and that's why this needs to be one part of a much larger approach, a unified approach to address the underlying issues that have led to the forced labor in the first place.
Blake, do you got anything to add on there?
No, I think Nate covered it exactly right. And I fully agree. It is why we need this engagement by the US government. It's why we need engagement by our allies. It's why we need engagement at international institutions. I think the private sector understands, everyone's gotten the message that there is absolutely a responsibility here, but it is just one piece. And the UFLPA is not a tool to stop the forced labor practices. We need more. And so we hope, we hope that there is a coordinated effort. We've certainly seen it in signs that there is more coordination among allies in the last year or so, and we hope that continues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to say I don't, have as much visibility into what's happening on the ground, in companies or on the factory floor, but just sitting in Washington and sometimes having to deal with the Chinese embassy and with their press representatives, it does feel like the pressure has been turned up on them, right? Like they are much keener to throw out these denials, throw out these, so the narrative of we're not forcing anyone to do anything. We're alleviating poverty. These people were impoverished. We're not oppressing them. We're giving them opportunity. They want to be in these work camps. They want to be doing this. Well, I sat at the Chinese embassy for, a conversation with them a few months ago, and they just hammered this into us. You know what I mean? Really, really keen to spin this. And I thought, when you see that from that regime, usually you think, oh, wow, they're feeling some pressure about this. So that was just a very interesting, data point for me that, wow, they really wanted to bring us in here to tell us we're not doing what you say we're doing. You know what I mean? And that usually means that they're feeling a little bit of pressure. So that was an interesting thing for me as well. We've got just a few minutes here more. I think, a good way to end up here would just be to say, what if you're a small company, you're trying to deal with these new things, you have limited resources. Give us some pearls of wisdom, just a little bit of advice. Do we go to the highest, the highest risk supply chains first? What do we look for? Maybe it's the ILO's like forced labor criteria. Like, what do I look for if I'm a company trying to navigate this?
That's a good question as well. For a smaller company, I think it's you would need to work with your trade association. This is something that we need to work together on. And Blake and my associations, we've been working together on this issue for almost 3 years now. Actually, we're coming up on the 3-year anniversary, actually. We realized that we've created something called the Forced Labor Working Group. We realized that even with everybody in our industry, that wasn't enough. We need to bring in other industries. We need to bring in the entire business community to try and figure out the best approaches and best practices. And that's the resources that a small company would need to sort of tap into. You know, what kind of guidance have people put out? We put out guidance for our members on this issue, but it really needs to be a collective approach and learn from those and look at risk-based models where you think you have the most chance of issues in your supply chain. For the larger forced labor issue, there's a lot of government publications from the US government and from international institutions that can help you figure that out. Use what the resources are out there to try and at least narrow the problem. You still have the fundamental issue that you have to have the traceability and transparency, but help you hone that so that you're focusing on the areas that need it most first.
Yeah, I agree. The lawyer in me always says consult the lawyer, but that's terrible. All the lawyers on the line are happy. But yeah, I mean, Nate's right. I think, you know, if you're a small company and you are a member of a trade association, absolutely leverage them. Absolutely familiarize yourself with the government guidance. So again, I mentioned there's 2 separate websites for just the UFLPA. There's on DHS.gov, so the Department of Homeland Security, they have a webpage for the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. And they have the enforcement strategy on there, frequently asked questions, the entity list, which will change, we understand, you know, over time. And then there is the CBP importer guidance that is on its UFLPA webpage. The importer guidance, I believe it's the importer guidance, lists a bunch of other government publications that provide guidance as well. There's a Xinjiang business advisory that was put out 2 years ago, 18 months ago, maybe. Time is crazy. But, you know, there are a lot of resources like that are available. I think familiarize yourself first and foremost with those. And then tap into, you know, any organizations at your disposal who might be able to plug you into the larger conversation and get you some guidance. And I think otherwise also reach out to CBP. Mm-hmm. You know, if you don't have a center that you're assigned to, a center of excellence, or you don't have a national account manager, you know, there are still, you know, my advice would be to still, you know, to reach out to them as well. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, all great little advice points there. And I would just add one more. You know, if you ever hit a brick wall with customs, you can always drop a line to your friendly neighborhood trade reporter. So gbade@politico.com. It's on the website too. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I certainly learned a lot from our conversation. I hope everyone in the audience did as well. Let's please let's give a thank you to Blake Harden, the Vice President at the Retail Industry Leaders Association, and Nate Herman, Senior Vice President at the American Apparel and Footwear Association. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your thoughts. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.